consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Paul Barclay, a professor of history at Lafayette College, to talk about his book, Outcasts of Empire: Japan's Rule on Taiwan's Savage Border, 1874 to 1945. Dr. Barclay, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Nakota.
So your book is called Outcasts of Empire: Japan's Rule on Taiwan's quote-unquote savage border, 1874 to 1945. When I was a graduate student at the University of Oregon, Bryna Goodman, who was actually previously on this podcast, assigned us this book to read in a class that she taught about colonialism. So it's nice that after having read that book a couple years ago, now we get to have a conversation about that book. So I guess just jumping into it, can you just give the audience a little bit of a cursory overview of what it is that you're arguing? And then in that explanation, include historical and geographic context surrounding this period of time between Japan and Taiwan for those who aren't that familiar.
Yes, I would be really happy to do that. I guess to start off with, I would just want to make the simple point that this book is available to read online or to download at no cost from the University of California website, if that's useful. I mean, you could buy a paperback, but this is an open access text, so there's that. But to get to the main points of the book, I think one of the things I want people to really understand from this book is that the modern Japanese empire lasted from 1868 through 1945, and it had many lasting effects for Asia beyond just the death, destruction, and devastation of the Asia-Pacific War that started in 1941. And Taiwan is an important, though often overlooked, part of this empire. In fact, Taiwan itself, as an object and subject of history, was fundamentally transformed by these 51 years of Japanese colonial rule, which occurred from 1895 to 1945. And the heart of this book's narrative is to show that one of the many legacies of Japanese colonial rule in Taiwan was the creation of the indigenous territory as a distinctly modern political formation. And part of the reason I wrote this book was there's a research opportunity here, because within the sort of rich historiography on the Japanese empire in Taiwan, Taiwan indigenous peoples appear as undifferentiated aborigines, and they're really only mentioned in passing. And I think we do need a book dedicated to this topic, because in imperial times, the span of it from 1868 up through 1945, Taiwan indigenous peoples were prominent in Japanese discourse, policy making, and the colonial political economy as a whole, the Japanese empire. And so if we think about the Japanese empire or imperial Japan, for most Americans, that's Japan plus the territory conquered by the Army and Navy after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And one might think about Midway Island or Iwo Jima, or even French Indochina, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. And those are part of a Japanese empire after 1941. And there's been books upon books written about this Pacific War. And there is still more to say about that war. But Japan's modern empire really begins in 1868 with the restoration of the emperor. It does not begin with Pearl Harbor in 1941. And it's from 1868 through 1932 about that the colonies, protectorates, and prefectures that were acquired and conquered and annexed. This is the empire that Japan is defending in the war that occurs after 1941. And this earlier empire, built over decades of time, has different dynamics and it has different consequences than the more infamous 1941 to 45 war. And to illustrate, let's just talk briefly about imperial expansion from the 1870s through the teens to set up the book in a context of settler colonialism and territorial aggrandizement. So we know that the Meiji Restoration occurs in 1868, and the island formerly known as Yezo becomes Hokkaido in 1871. That involves the dispossession of the Ainu people and some settler colonialism. Chiishima, or the Northern Territory, still disputed by Russia, become part of Japan in 1875. 4 years later, the Ryukyu Islands, which later becomes Okinawa Prefecture, is added. And then we get a big addition after the Qing-Japanese War of 1895, and that is Taiwan. It's ceded to Japan as a condition of the peace treaty that ends this war. A decade later, a war against Russia brings the southern half of Sakhalin Island into the empire, south of the 50th parallel, known as Karafuto. And then Korea becomes a protectorate at the same time in November of that year. And we add the Kwangtung Least Territory in 1906, again after the Russo-Japanese War, and that becomes the hub of the more famous South Manchurian Railway. And Korea is finally annexed formally in 1910 on the plan of Taiwan's government general. Now we have a Korea government general, which is to say that by 1920, the Empire of Japan is a multicultural, far-flung empire. And its projects in education, infrastructure, counterinsurgency, and assimilation campaigns, most prominently carried out in Taiwan and Korea, are large, decades-long projects, including Japanese migration and settlement to China, Micronesia, Sakhalin, and Hokkaido, and Okinawa, in addition to Taiwan and Korea. And the long-term processes of modern colonialism transform these territories physically and demographically. So let's talk about Taiwan, Japan's first formal colonial possession. It's about 100 miles from the coast of China, across from Fujian province, and it's about 100 miles from the southernmost islands of Okinawa Prefecture. Now, the majority population of Taiwan are Han Chinese from Fujian province, and during the Qing dynasty, in fact, Taiwan was mostly a prefecture of Fujian province right down to 1887 when it becomes its own province. Taiwan is seized from the Qing dynasty by the Japanese in 1895, analogously to how Hong Kong was taken from the Qing by the British in 1842. And so for today's kind of politics, and we think about PRC, People's Republic of China, kind of claims on Taiwan as this lost or renegade province within that kind of historical framework, that dates back to that time, and the analogy with Hong Kong would be prominent. And of course, there are counter arguments to that. But for our purposes, we might think of Taiwan in part as a colonial laboratory where Japanese colonists and imperialists built a template that was exported to Korea mainly, but also other parts of it to Northeast China and Micronesia. As a military base, most famously, the attacks on the Philippine Islands were launched from Taiwan in 1941 and 42, 41 for those. And there are other important functions of Taiwan in the wider empire as a resource colony or a food basket, as an exporter of sugar, rice, tea, bananas, pineapples, and for our talk, camphor, a wood product, or the byproduct of lumbering, is also exported from Taiwan and is a big part of the story of indigenous peoples and Japan. So topography is very important to thinking about Japanese colonial rule in Taiwan and for thinking about indigenous peoples in Taiwan under Japanese colonial rule. So we would crudely divide Taiwan into a Western plains and Eastern mountains. This is a very crude device, but it helps us think about the way this colony was built and maintained. So let's say between 2 and 4% of Taiwan's population inhabits about half of its territory. And these are indigenous peoples. They speak Austronesian languages. They're less densely settled than Han Chinese or Han Taiwanese in the Western Plains. And on Chink maps, we see the island just sort of bifurcated into governed territory and so-called savage territory. And under Japanese rule, and this is a modern innovation, we see the indigenous territories not as ungoverned territory, but as specially governed territory, territory that has different rules and territory that is ethnically distinct from Chinese Taiwan and ethnically distinct within the indigenous territory, divided by ethno-linguistic groups who are depicted in the colonial bureaucratic imaginary as these cartographic polygons. This sort of, we could call it cartographic modernity, or we could think about them in other ways, which we can circle back to. But to stay on point here,
Sorry,
Taiwan
if I could,
indigenous, yeah,
yeah,
please.
yeah. If I could just show me, because I'm trying to think about some of the questions that people in the audience might have. When Japan was beginning its colonization of Taiwan, you just showed a map there. Where's were the Japanese mostly inhabiting? Were they inhabiting the north, southeast, west? If you could just sort of describe for us generally where the main center of Japanese influence was happening on the island.
Well, that's a great question. So the Japanese army itself and the Navy, they make their first landings in Penghu, or what's known as the Pescadore Islands, in March of 1895. And they suffer horrific losses from disease. And that's where the Navy establishes itself. But then when we move in to late July and August of 1895, they establish a beachhead just to the east of Geelong on the north part of the island, where they can establish a naval landing. And then they march along the littoral to Geelong Harbor. And then from there, they move to Taipei, which has only recently become the capital of Qing Taiwan. It had been Tainan for most of that period. And having established the rudiments of an administration in Taipei, they then send armies to march down the western plains of Taiwan, all the way down to about Tainan. So to think of Taiwan that way, the administrative and military hubs of Japanese colonial rule are basically in Taipei, and then they move down to provincial capitals like Lugong, which is a port, and down to Tainan, and it's the western half of Taiwan, basically down to Kaohsiung, and that's where you will find Japanese armies and navies, and then settlers will come later, and so it begins with a military presence, then an administrative presence, and then settlers start coming mainly to old cities, and they don't live in the Japanese don't live in the countryside by and large till the 19 teens. So I think to integrate this history, this is a book in Japanese history that takes Taiwan quite seriously. I believe I made 9 different trips to Taiwan before I finished writing this book. And sometimes I was there for 3 months at a time. So it's a Japan history book, but I really treated Taiwan as the center of the book, and I've been to all of the places that I write about. But so I'm going to put it into a narrative of Japanese history for a minute here, despite that. So in the 1870s, we have the Mudan Village incident, which is Japan's first foreign war. In the 1890s to 1900s, we have Japanese mass media's fascination with Taiwan indigenous peoples. Concurrently, in the late 1890s and 1900s, we witness the government general of Taiwan build a camphor monopoly, which means the wars against northern indigenous peoples are integral to financing the colony. And then moving later into that decade, starting in 1906, we have several military offensives against Atayal and Truku peoples and a 17 million yen budget to prosecute a war. And then in 1930, the famous Musha Rebellion led by Mona Rudao. And so these are some big ticket items that integrate Taiwan indigenous peoples into the story of the Japanese Empire. And in the book, I go through them in various levels of detail to illustrate how indigenous Taiwan exists as a modern political formation. And I begin with that 1874 occupation of the Longchao Peninsula, which is renamed Hongchun in 1875. That's the southernmost tip of Taiwan. And Japan goes there and it burns down the villages of Taiwanese with a P, ethnic group. They live in southern Taiwan. They're not Chinese. And over 500 Japanese people die of illness in this expedition. And this expedition provokes the Qing dynasty to intensify its government presence in Taiwan. They build the walled city of Hongchun in 1875, and in 1887, they make Taiwan a province. And in this chapter of the book, we meet Taiwanese people like Chun Tatorara, a woman of the Puyuma or Beinan group who's multilingual, and she works with a Japanese interpreter to mobilize troops against remnant Qing soldiers. And her father was a Qing period landowner. Pan Wenjie, who's also known as Bunkiet, is a man who served as an interpreter between American, Japanese, Qing, and Taiwanese peoples in the 1870s. And in the 1890s, he was between Japanese and Taiwanese peoples as an interpreter and a local strongman. So throughout the book, I try to tease out these individual stories of people that don't get that much attention in stories that focus on only the economic aspects of imperialism. As we move into Japanese formal colonial rule in 1895, 2 decades after the Mudan Village incident, one of the things that you notice if you study Japanese history is that most pictures and images of Taiwan in the early period of Japanese rule, they're dominated by imagery of indigenous people to the exclusion of Han Taiwanese. In fact, I did a quantitative analysis of Japanese textbooks, and you have 2% of the population are indigenous Taiwanese, and they're depicted far more often than the 98% of Han Taiwanese. And you can look at textbooks issued by the Ministry of Education, and the first edition in the 1900s. It depicts a famous local headman from Palan near Musha. In the 19-teens, it's two people from a place near Ulai, known as Juchi or Kushaku in Japanese. And then when we move into the late 19-teens and early 20s, it's two other people from Ulai. That's the face of Taiwan to people in Japan. So 3 million Han Taiwanese, 100,000 indigenous Taiwanese, and the regime of representation is inversely proportional to who lives in Taiwan. And I think that's really interesting. And so I excavated these images, and they cohere around these very important encounters between Taiwanese indigenous peoples and Japanese administrators. So there's a big meeting that occurs in Dashi, Taipei on September 8th, and the group moves to Taipei on September 9th, 1895, very early in Japanese colonial rule. And this indigenous delegation from Jiaoshanban, or Jiaobanshan, sorry, the name has changed over the years. In Japanese, it's known as Kappan-san. They come to Taipei and they meet the governor general, and these photographs are taken, and then they turn into lithographs, and they're published in atlases, textbooks, mass media, and they become the face of Taiwan. There's another famous encounter on August 26th, 1897. Not famous, but I'll say it was productive, between a man named Piho Sapo and Ino Kanori, a Japanese ethnologist. And the picture he takes, it shows up again in travel logs, geography textbooks, even in foreign books about Taiwan. And we get another portrait taken in February of 1903 in a border area named Ulai by a headman named Watan Yura and his daughter. Another man from Ulai named Marai Watan is photographed in 1903. And the book takes this excavation of photographs that are so prominent in Japan, and it puts faces with the names. This woman's name is Paze Watan. She was a multilingual daughter of a headman who brokered commerce and travel for Japanese people who were new to the interior of Taiwan. And so the people in these photographs were by and large Atayal and Tagadaya leaders and their daughters who were intermediaries between the colonial state and indigenous society, And so these viral portraits, and I call them viral because they were photographs, they were lithographs, they appeared in all kinds of format. They were taken during the prosecution of these resource wars. So they look like pictures of people with interesting customs and different languages that have this sort of fascination for consumers in the metropole. But the reason that the photographs were able to be taken was that they were adjacent to a war zone. That's why the Japanese are there, in fact. So we can reconstruct networks between daughters of headmen, ethnographers, Japanese policemen, and capitalists like Dogura Ryujiro by reading Taiwan and Japan newspapers and diaries of traveling and matching them to photographs from their captions. And we reconstruct this world of Taiwan's borderland in the early 20th century, which is a project of intercultural negotiation coupled with brute force application of military ordnance and guns and commercial incentives. So I try to recreate in this book the complexity of this first decade of colonial rule. Then moving to the second decade of colonial rule, we have these camphor wars. Japan is trying to parlay its global monopoly on this rare wood called camphor, which when it's cut into chips and rendered into a crystalline kind of precipitate, you can make things out of it like piano keys or combs or film or smokeless gunpowder or mosquito repellent. I was once told it would make my hair grow back. It's a really valuable commodity, and Japan's willing to fight to get it. So this is, by and large, the savage border that is in the book's title. It's pretty much coextensive with where camphor trees grow.
And was this a term? Was this a term that? Sorry, was this a term that the Japanese actually used? Did they call this the savage border, or is this a term that was okay? I see.
And so did the Qing. So in Chinese, it was often known as the Fanjie. In Japanese, the Bankai, and Bankai is this area between administered Taiwan with walled cities and intensive rice agriculture and sugarcane and people who reckon descent as Han Taiwanese and then people who are Austronesians. And so it's kind of Hakka or Kuja people and indigenous peoples who are bicultural that live in this band called the Savage Border. And then the land's interior are just known as the Savage Territory, the Banchi, and or the Fandi. And so this is a term that I'm taking from the historical period. And these wars produce horrific casualties, 500 fatalities per year in the early 20th century to supply the government general with between 15 and 30% of its Taiwan generated revenue. And it's important to understand that you couldn't get IMF or World Bank aid in 1900 to run a colony. Japan had to generate its own capital to pay for this colony, and it did not want to borrow money abroad, which it had to do for the Russo-Japanese War, and that gives other countries a say in what you're going to do. So there's a lot of pressure to make Taiwan pay, and camphor is a way to make that happen, but you have to fight the indigenous peoples that live in the camphor forests to get the product out in the quantity that you want to get it out in. You can buy the product from indigenous land managers, but they want all kinds of fees, and that method is not good for intensive capitalism. The ante is raised in 1906 when Governor General Sakuma Samata takes the reign. He invests 17 million yen in wars of conquest in the highlands. He spends as much money on this war as Japan spends building the deep water harbor of Geelong, Taiwan's busiest commercial port. They pour 6,000 to 7,000 frontline troops annually into this war in the first decade of the 19 teens, just up to World War I. And it is a war. It's not a police action. People get war decorations, they get war bonuses, they get buried at Yasukuni Shrine for fighting in this. This is a war. And then Taiwan indigenous peoples last kind of enter the stream of Japanese empire another 15 years after this war in the infamous Musha Rebellion of October 27, 1930. I'm jumping ahead here, but this is the next kind of big event. And here, 134 Japanese men, women, and children are killed on a sports day by about 300 Sidek warriors led by Monorudao. And the Japanese retaliate by killing over 900 in the aftermath of this. And they also relocate whole villages into a concentration camp. And the governor general resigns to take responsibility for this debacle. So that's one aspect of this book. And then that is to put indigenous Taiwanese people back into Japanese imperial history. But if we're going to talk about Taiwan indigenous peoples themselves, this book argues that indigenization is a modern phenomenon, occurs in kind of two major phases. I call it a two-part invention in the book. Part one is the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and part two is top-down ethnogenesis. In other words, this is a state-led and commercial-led project in redefining indigenous ethnicity in a modern way that is commensurate to nation-state notions of territoriality and sovereignty, but also with the commercial impulses to satisfy an urban audience's nearly insatiable appetite for artifacts of so-called primitivity. So part one, I've talked about, and that is the territorial separation of indigenous territory from the rest of Taiwan. And this is a brute force affair. It involves scorched earth trails, which are staffed with bunkers and gun holes and electrical wires. And this is a global phenomenon of taking land from indigenous peoples and projects in forced migration and reservation building, which is no different in Taiwan than it would be in other imperial settings, but it would have its local inflection because it builds on a tradition of Qing dynasty frontier management. And so there's some continuities with the Qing, but there's also a scaling up of the technology and the violence. Part two, which I spent quite a bit of time on in the book, and I'll telescope it and collapse it here a little bit for the purposes of our chat, is this idea that the colonial bureaucratic ethnographic imagination makes itself a part of indigenous life through this process of creating administrative territory, redefining a political economy, and then incorporating Taiwan into this larger metropolitan Japanese colonial imaginary. And so for readers of the book, you will see a number of photographs, postcards, etchings, and maps that show how people in Taipei, to manage their colony, tried to map ethnicity onto the sort of geobody or the shape of Taiwan in a way that would make it legible to people that didn't really understand Taiwan, and it would translate the complexity of Taiwan's topography and ethnic variety into the language of basically cartographic modernity, which is different colored territories that abut each other on a flat map. And these accompany the census. And so when you take a census, you classify people. And then the way they're classified becomes part of their reality, because that determines how you're going to apply taxation and law and other forms of mobilization. And so I call this top-down ethnogenesis because a lot of the outer forms of indigeneity are imposed by a state. And that does not mean that people in indigenous Taiwan don't already know who they are. They know who they are, and they know they're not Chinese, but this gives it another way of being expressed in the political, economic lives of colonial subjects. And so we can look at different maps of Taiwan as they're generated in Qing times, in early Japanese times, and in later Japanese times, and we can see this movement towards redefining the highlands of Taiwan as an ethnically plural place that is completely separate from Chinese Taiwan, which was never true. Of course, people that are administratively distinct still trade, they intermarry, they migrate. Taiwan never looked at the ground level like these maps portrayed it, but maps have a sort of power to organize resources and administration and policing power in a way that can make these projections into something approaching a reality or part of a reality. So if we think about this, to wrap up here, during the Qing dynasty, we have administered territory where Han people live, and then we have an external Taiwan, which is just called savage Taiwan. In the early years of Japanese colonial rule, we have administered space, and then we have space that's yet to be administered, but will be in good time. So the savage border is kind of an absence in this language, but it's potentially a presence. And from 1904 to 1914, there's a plastic conception here of this borderline. It's moving in tandem with these camphor wars. And it is really only the areas in the southernmost parts of Taiwan and in the Eastern Rift Valley, where Amis and Puyuma people live, that indigenous peoples kind of become part of municipal governments in this colony. But after 1914 and going down to 1945, Taiwan is bifurcated into normal administration and special administration, not non-administration, but special administration. And that means indigenous peoples are not going to be taxed the same way. They're not going to get the same kinds of schools, the same kinds of infrastructure. They will be ruled by Japan, but they will not be autonomous, and they will not be integrated into a capitalist political economy the same way that lowland Taiwanese will, or Koreans will, or people in Northeast China. And so the carryover to modern contemporary Taiwan is this notion that indigenous peoples, as represented by the Council of Indigenous Peoples in the executive UN today, are these territorially distinct peoples that live in ethnically homogenous spaces that are very separate from the rest of Taiwan. And this is an important representation because it gives indigenous peoples a language of territoriality and sovereignty with which to recover land and rights and lineage and resources and dignity, because this is the language of modern sovereignty. There aren't other languages. And this is partly a construct, and how that construct is used by different peoples is an open question and is still being played out. So I think I will just let you ask more questions now. I hope that sets up the book, and I hope it wasn't excessive.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving us this talk and this overview of the work that you go over in this book. Before we go, I think you briefly mentioned it at the beginning of our talk, but you do have the book. It's available, I believe, on the UC Press website. It's also available on Amazon. But if for whatever reason someone's interested in your work, but maybe they can't buy the book, it's actually available for free. Can you just briefly talk about that for a second?
Yes, the book is available for free, and that is from the University of California website. You can get it in a PDF. You can read it in their interface. You could read it in JSTOR if you have a library ID. You can get it from Amazon Kindle for free if you don't have those things. So basically, if you have access to an internet connection, you can read it for free. But if you don't have that access, you can get a PDF copy from somebody that does have internet access. And to get that feature, I raised money with the Mellon Foundation, with my library at Lafayette College, and I raised money to make this book available to anybody because it's a book about indigeneity. And if you look at what's going on in the world today, indigenous peoples, I think, should be able to have access to this book. So I just had to waive my rights to royalties and raise a little bit of money, and I could make the book free.
Dr. Barclay, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or NakotaDefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.